to, thank you, Anna. Welcome everyone to yet another episode of Academic Integrity. I'm going to share my screen so that we can get on. Everybody see that?
Thought you were doing an introduction before you got started, Paul.
I am going to do an introduction, but I just wanted to have my slides so that I could feel like I have slides. So the associate deans present basically at the end of every semester. I'm Paul Tomaschek in Liberal Arts and Sciences, and we have Rehan.
Hello. Well, let's tell the truth, okay? Paul presents. We come here for moral support because Paul does such an awesome job. We're here to back him up.
And we're also joined by Chris.
Hi everybody, I'm Chris Munger, Associate Dean in the School of Education, and it's good to see you, Brandon.
Yes. And we have Jen Knapp as well.
Hi, everybody. Associate Dean, School of Communication, Media, and the Arts. No S on communication, please and thank you.
So the other person of note here is Brandon Bennett, who most of you don't know. I feel fairly confident in saying he is our almost brand new Director of Student Conduct. And he is an important part of everything that we'll be talking about here during this period, although he's extremely, extremely new here. So he doesn't yet have really the lay of the land from an Oswego perspective, but he has great experience in all of this stuff from his previous times, and we welcome him.
Thanks so much, Paul. Good to meet all of you, and I'm super excited to work with everyone and get a solid grasp of how academic integrity has been going and what I can do to best support all of you.
So if one of my other Associate Dean colleagues could mind the chat while I go through these, it would help.
I'll do that. I'll take care of that.
So we vary the presentation depending on the sort of the item of the day. We've frequently gone through the numbers, and then during the pandemic, the numbers sort of morphed into weird things. And then the intellectual integrity policy became the academic integrity policy this past year, and we've been talking about that. So what I wanted to talk about today was really a little bit of procedure and a little bit of philosophy. And the philosophy comes down to what is it that we, the associate deans, the student conduct office, what do we want from faculty? And I think it can be summed up relatively easily with these two things. One is that we want people to take integrity seriously and to communicate that seriousness to your students. And we want you as the model of all things to model the behaviors from your students that you would like. So those are very large scale philosophical things, and it may be hard to imagine exactly how you will implement those, but I'd like to recommend against implementation that involves some of these old chestnuts that I've seen and I've heard over the years. I'm not going to waste class time on this. I've heard that directly from colleagues. I have a zero tolerance policy. I know people who have that in their syllabus, and just don't do it. So the idea of your entire conversation with a class on academic integrity being summed up in those 4.5 words, just don't do it, is not effective. And if we're trying to instill a culture of integrity, we need to, from the start, make sure that students understand what we want them to do, what's going to happen if they don't do these things, and that that there are better things that they can be doing with their time rather than devising elaborate cheating schemes. So that's the large scale view of things. We want those things to not show up, and in their place, we would like people to have conversations. We would like people to make it clear what what is not acceptable. We would like you to spend a little class time talking about, if you have a class in which plagiarism is a problem, we want you to talk to students about proper citation, about what you can do to avoid these things. There are a bunch of things that we know are effective. Being watchful is important. So we know that these things are going to happen regardless of how our culture changes. But, so being watchful is important. But that doesn't mean being a troll or being a police officer or, being a jackbooted thug of some sort. Being watchful is just making sure that you're doing your part in the monitoring process, in the reporting process, because by reporting students when they actually do things wrong, it allows us to track them over time. And if we have someone who has a real problem with this, and they cheat in this class and they plagiarize in that class, and they have multiple offenses, we want to be able to take those students aside and make sure that they understand what the repercussions are. We would like everyone to avoid inviting the circumstances that lead to these behaviors, because there are a lot of things that we know are going to favor students cheating, favor students plagiarizing. I understand that high stakes tests are the norm in a lot of fields. That's something that you could sit in on probably 80 different cell workshops just over the past 72 hours that give you alternatives to doing that. High stakes tests put more pressure on students, and a lot of students who otherwise wouldn't cheat use that as the fulcrum that pushes them toward cheating. So if there's something that you can do to change your grading schema and make high stakes exams less high stakes, that will help. If you're an online instructor or if you have online assessments, you should understand. And if you want to talk to Liz Schmidt about this, she'd be very happy to give you the long and the short. If you are using textbook prompts, if you're using questions from a question bank, they are out there. Students will be using them. There's just no question that those are not going to be effective, and that students are going to be using test bank answers that they have. So it puts pressure on an instructor to come up with different prompts, to come up with different questions. And even that in the world of Chegg is not a perfect fix, but you can guarantee if you're just using straight textbook content provided stuff, that the answers are going to be out there, and it's not difficult enough for students to avoid that it's not going to be used. I've become aware of the fact that there are instructors that don't have students draft large writing assignments. I don't understand how that can be, but it is. And you should expect that if you have a student who has a 10-page paper that's due on the last day of classes, who hasn't had any sort of drafting up to that point, that the likelihood that there's going to be some sort of irregularity or problem with citation, or indeed some sort of plagiarism, is going to be very high. You have a role in modeling the behavior for the student. You can direct them in the right way. If they continue to not follow your directions, then at that point you can lower the boom on them. But I don't set things up to make it so that these things will happen. use the resources that are available. The Writing Center, if you have a student who turns in a draft that is riddled with plagiarism, write a note, tell the student, go to the Writing Center, take them this note, Steve Smith, dear Steve, this paper is riddled with plagiarism. Can you do something to help the student? And they will help the student. If they have a concrete thing that they can do to help someone, they can do a good job in helping them. Penfield Library has a bunch of online tools for plagiarism avoidance, for all sorts of different best practices. They're there for students to use. Direct students toward these resources proactively. One that I've dealt with myself, I've got a class of fill in the blank, 100 students, 60 students, however many. I don't have, I can't possibly be watching all of these students all the time. Well, ask someone to help, get a colleague to help. If it comes to it, if you're teaching one of these classes where you have students face to face taking an exam and you're worried that they're cheating, call me up. And if I don't have a meeting, I will come and help you. I'll be one of the people walking around in your classroom. Don't use that as an excuse for allowing students to get away with things. So, the procedural part, reporting, it's easy. All you have to do is, if you think that something has happened, consult with the student, preferably not by email, but sometimes it's unavoidable. Contact the student, say, I'd like to talk to you about what happened on the exam yesterday. I'd like to talk to you about this paper that you turned in. Present your evidence, allow them to give their perspective. If they throw themselves upon your mercy at that point and say, I know I made a terrible mistake, well, that's great. That's a conversation that you can have. You shouldn't at this point be saying, you're going to fail. You could say, well, this is very serious, and this is one of the things that could lead to a failing grade. I'll have to discuss this, or I'll have to think about this, but you should go into this discussion with an open mind, regardless of what your predisposition is. If in this case, you've sent the student a message, you've sent the student a second message, they don't respond, well, you can move forward without talking to them, but you have to give them an opportunity to state their case. Let your department chair or your program director know that you've got this. It may be that, that they don't really need to know, but it's good for them to know. If you're a junior faculty member, it's good to get some advice from them. If you're not a junior faculty member, it's good for them to know, just from the standpoint of, if this student appeals this, they then know something about it in advance. So it puts them in a stronger position to be able to discuss things with students who are unhappy. Once you determine what you're going to do with this, you need to let the student know. And this, okay, seems obvious, but it's not necessarily always the case. They need to be apprised in writing. I have gone through the evidence. I've determined that this is a significant violation, and I am doing this as a consequence. And that's it. You also need to inform them that if you decide that you're not assessing an academic penalty, you need to tell them that, so they're not thinking, oh, what am I going to do? But it's always good to tell them that I have registered this in the system. So I've reported this as a violation because I want to make sure that there's no problem going forward. And then you submit the report to Maxient. And in Maxient, I recognize that the report system is not perfect. We're inching toward perfection. It's going to ask you a bunch of questions about student demographics. All we need is the name and the ID number. You don't have to put in whether they're left-handed, whether they come from a upstanding home, anything like that. Just name and ID number. It will ask you to summarize whatever. Sometimes I get extremely brief summaries of what has happened and it forces me to go back to the instructor and say, hey, can you give me some more detail on this? We don't need to have a tome, but we do need to know what happened in broad strokes. We need to know whether it was on a big assignment or a small assignment. And if you were able to talk to the student, what did they say? Did they deny responsibility? Did they accept something? You know, what did they tell you? That's what we need to know. And remember that from a sort of formative standpoint, it's okay to tell the student, look, we've talked about plagiarism. I thought that I gave you the information that you need. You continued to do this. I'm going to put this into the system that you've plagiarized. On this occasion, since it's a discussion post that's only worth 0.5% to the course grade, I'm not going to give you a penalty, but you need to do this, this, and this. So you can have someone in the system despite not giving an academic penalty. So the other things, so that you know, the new policy as it's written, does not allow students to withdraw from a class in which they receive a failing grade as a consequence of an intellectual integrity violation. Now, this is not, again, the rules as written, this is a failing grade in the course. This is not saying that a student can't withdraw from a course if they cheated on something that was worth 5% and they're going to end up, doing whatever they do in the class. This is for those cases where a student has received a failing grade in the course because the violation was significant. You don't need to do anything about this. You submit the report as it is. We will take care of it. If we see that it's a failing grade in the course as the penalty, we will make sure that the student, if they've attempted to withdraw, they won't be allowed. If they've been permitted a withdrawal, somehow we will unwithdraw them from the course. There is no getting out of this. They will be tracked down. For the bad ones, and we do occasionally see bad ones, what we refer to as the level 3 violation. In the rules as written, there's something about elevated to student conduct, pausing the academic penalty process. What we really want you to do is just submit the violation report as it is. If we need to follow up with you, we will. It'll basically be between your associate dean and the director of student conduct. And we will make sure that, that consequences are meted out.
Paul, there's a question in the chat from Anne.
Sure. What does it say?
So failing as a direct penalty or failing because the numbers work out that way if fail a big task?
Yeah, as I see it, the rules as written are facing the potential of a failing grade in the course will not be permitted to withdraw. That is anything that constitutes a failing grade. So something that is a 0 on a assignment that makes it impossible for them to pass the class after that, or just the nuclear option, which is the failing grade in the course. So that's one for which it's good to know in the report that the student is going to receive a 0 on this thing that is worth half of their grade. They have no chance of passing the class as a consequence.
I don't know if Anne is asking if they would fail it regardless. I don't know. The way I read it, I'm not sure on the question. So if the failing is going to happen regardless, is that what you're asking?
Well, I think Paul understood what I meant. Say you've got some term paper that is it's violated tremendously, and say, for example, it was worth 30% and it pulls somebody under. So even though you're assessing the penalty only on the particular task where the violation took place, by happenstance, the way the numbers pan out, then it brings them under. And I think Paul
Yeah.
answered either way, that you, if it happens to pull them under, or if you decide that the penalty itself is directly failing a failure for the course across the board, then I understand that
Yeah.
it
and
applies.
if
The
it
answer I
makes
thought
it-
was both.
Yeah, if it makes it impossible for them to pass the class by getting whatever the grade is in the assignment, that in my mind is a failing grade as a consequence of an integrity violation. So either one, they won't be able to escape. Right, so the bad ones, again, you don't have to do anything special for this. You don't have to make a special selection of in the penalty thing. You don't have to say judicial. Basically, determine what your academic penalty would be for this based on the situation, failing grade in the course or whatever, and we'll look over what actually happened and say, wow, this is really bad. We need to do X, Y, or Z. X, Y, or Z might include coming back to you to get more detail. It would probably include bringing the student in and talking to them directly about this to let them know that this is something that's gone beyond the class level. But it's not something that's going to mean more time on your part, which is one of the significant things that we're trying to emphasize with reporting in general. We're doing everything we can to try to remove burden from you, because we realize that there is burden involved and there's no way to get away from that. But extra burden, we're trying to pull away so you don't have to worry about that. And last but not least, the XE grade is one that was brought in the implementation of the new policy, and that is the designation that is applied by student conduct. So again, this is something that instructors don't have to worry about. If a student receives a failing grade in the course as their academic penalty, then the director of student conduct will look over the situation and say, yeah, this goes beyond just a failing grade. This was a student who was selling exams to other students, something that's truly outside of the norms. Or it could be, this is the third violation from the student where we've already told them that they're on thin ice. The XE grade is the notation in the transcript that the student has not just failed a class, but they've failed it as a result of an integrity violation. They have the potential of having that removed from their record, but it's A, not something that's automatic, and B, it's not something that will necessarily be easy for them to get out of. So if you see a student who gets an XE grade, it's a serious thing. That's, I think, it. I was hoping that we would have time for discussion about things. Naturally, your associate dean is always interested in talking to you if you have these things come up at any time in the semester. If you're wondering how you should proceed, if you're wondering how you should, what sort of penalty you should use, anything like that, we're always happy to talk. And of course, Brandon is a real resource in all of this as well. And he will be getting to know you more personally as time goes by. He's not been on campus for a full month at this stage, so he has not really had much of an opportunity to get to know anyone. But questions? Would you
I'll
like
just
me
bring
to-
up this semester, something new. I actually had talked to Paul about it, but one thing I did this semester is early on, I caught, a Chegg uploading of my own questions. So I had an alert for it and I caught them. And so I caught one student posting and a few students using them. And for a couple that had kind of really abused it on a test and stuff, they got the academic penalty, but I did, with Paul's permission, I emailed their other instructors. And which is allowable under FERPA to share that kind of information with your fellow faculty. But I emailed the other instructor and said, these people have Chegg accounts, right? They uploaded questions and they used answers, and this thing was tracked, and you just need to be aware in your own class. I don't really care, not really my business what you do about it, but you just need to be aware that these students we have in common, and this is what they're using. So.
I mean, to go along with what Liz said, I mean, the check problem, I mean, it is a major issue because one of our instructors has clearly stated in their syllabus that any use of check is not okay, and the students still did it. I mean, the student ultimately admitted it and was forthright. Oh, I was struggling, so I put it up, but I didn't use it on all that. But the point is that I think, I mean, dealing with check now, I guess is going to be same as breathing.
Well, it is, but it depends, again, unfortunately, I'll just say I have colleagues across disciplines that are too reliant on publisher materials and to run their classes. And that's really a big issue. When you have your own content, it's not as pervasive because when you have publisher content, students don't have to post it. They can just view it because someone's already posted it, right? Chances are in any significantly selling textbook, that's what's happened. With your own stuff, you really know that somebody had to post it as well. I would say I have not had a big, there was an isolated problem. I did, a general announcement in class, remember on the first day when we talked about don't force my hand because I'll do it. And this is what happened. And some people got, some very unpleasant news about their first test and, and are going forward kind of down instead of strong in the beginning of the semester. And so I just kind of had that general announcement and then it pretty much dried up. I don't know. I was talking to John at lunch and I'm like, I'm kind of scared there's another side I don't know about because Cheg's been a little too quiet lately. So I don't know if I'm just, behind the kids and the cool things they're using.
Probably I have a new tool we don't know about when we have to learn.
Well, you can search in Google and it'll come up on any site, Course Hero, Chegg, things like that. You just need the account for the answer. But yeah, so
I'll be honest with you, we learned, I didn't know about these things because at one point in time when the School of Business had their intellectual integrity task force, we actually brought students in and these were good students. So we asked them and they gave us names that I had never heard of and stuff. So I mean, you're right that there's probably the next cool tool that we don't know about.
Yeah.
Can I admit how by accident I may have worked around that?
please share, Anne. Please go
Many years ago, Barbara Gary advised me to actually make my handwritten solutions to the homework problems available to students before the due date. So that this was when we still had actual physical bulletin boards. And that way students who wouldn't have to rely on tracking down me during my office hours to get assistance. So if they needed some help, they could come have a peek at things. And I now have scanned them and I put them in to whatever course management system. And so students know that they can look there, at least see how I model how to approach and do the problem. And I'm doing one randomized numerical version and they still have to do their own. So I figure at least if they're needing to peek somewhere, they look at the way I like to see it done and they get that in. And
So Anne, that's interesting. Can I follow up? Do you find a big disconnect between homework performance and then exam performance because of that?
No, I have almost a direct correlation, except for the few outliers who don't do any homework and can walk in and brilliantly do well on the exam. And the few unfortunate students who work really hard and come get help directly and get great homework grades and then just melt down on the exam. So those are the only real outliers. Otherwise, there's a pretty direct correlation.
And how much do you weight your homework problems usually in your semester?
Depending on which category, the standard problems are only 10 or 15%, and I have reading quizzes and concept questions as well. It still amazes me though, even with the offered solutions, the overall average for the class is still only a 75. So it's really coming down to whether they bother to do it. And so.
Can I ask the collective mind something, your opinions? So how on campus do we like to handle falsification of attendance records, right? You've got a large class, people walk in and they sign in for their buddies and they just take turns or what have you.
Well, I would back up and think about attendance policies and how you're really measuring engagement in the class. So I had a different, the higher tech engagement version of this policy is back when iClicker used these physical devices that look like little remotes, right? A student would be in the back with like 6 remotes on their desk, right? And then I would catch them and I would go, and it would be really dramatic. And there are still stories about that. My son went to a bar in Baldwin's and I'm like, oh, I had this teacher and she took away the clickers. Anyway, and he pretended like, no, I don't know her, just the same last name. It's coincidence. I don't know who she is. So that was fun. So that's just a little aside. But so, I mean, even I would say clickers, but there was actually the equivalent to that. The great thing about using the benefits and costs of now having this clicker app that the university subscribes to is students don't lend each other their phones. Right? And they tend not to forget them. So students don't come to class with their phone and then 6 other phones that, retail for $1,000. They just don't do it. So in other words, if you're using iClicker work to measure engagement, so part of my iClicker scoring is, did you answer the question? Right. And another part of it is weighted, did you answer it correctly? Right. So you might give 50% credit for people who are just answering the questions in class. Right. And then maybe another 50% goes in whether or not the answer was correct. But when you do that, there's an attendance component built in. Now, by attendance, it could mean virtual or physical attendance on a phone. Right. So the thing about the device is it was a radio signal with a perimeter. And
close.
Right. So, I mean, but I guess you have to decide how important that is. But I guess, so I never attempted to take attendance in the large classes I teached. I felt it was just too unwieldy to try and do. So are you saying, do you do does this come to your attention because the signatures don't match over time? Do students have to sign next to their name or?
So it's come to my attention a couple of ways. And to be honest, I don't award specific participation points, right? But there's natural consequences for not coming to class, which is, of course, that you don't learn stuff and then you do poorly. But I like to track attendance because I find it really handy to have those records when those funny email messages come around about like verifying the last date of attendance and stuff. Like,
well, I'll take the associate dean hat, which I don't wear, but I'm just stealing it from Paul for a minute and putting it on and telling you that SUNY expects attendance records. So,
I feel very comfortable having them. I do enjoy having them.
You should have
and it's very handy to be able to explain to a student, right, that if you only came to 30% of the course, there might be a reason why you're failing. But it's all been very handy. But this has come to my attention. I don't do a lot of physical sign-ins. I've been using the Quickly, and I don't know what the new D2L thing is going to have. But the Quickly, you log into Blackboard and you just check in. And it was really great. I thought it was really great during the online teaching. And I then was using it in person too. But the students, some of them, very few of them, but some of them sort of caught on to like when in the class I would open up the check-in and they would just log into Blackboard and check in whether or not they were in class. And so, I had students self-reporting that they were in class, but then I knew they weren't there because I do know the students. And so I knew they weren't there. And I just find it it's dishonest. and I want them to know that we pay attention to them and that we know that they're not there, and that there's an element of concern and care. And, so there's again, the consequences are natural. They don't learn, they do poorly. Okay. And I don't do participation points in specific. But the question for everyone else, on campus, we expect attendance. There's not even an exemptions policy in the handbook, right? Like attendance is required. And so then, what's the best way forward for this? I see Kristen.
So that is covered in the revised policy. If I'm remembering it, I hope I have the right site pulled up, but it could be considered a level 2 violation, falsifying attendance, such as signing in for another student who is not present. Yeah. So, I mean, it's potentially a reportable violation, whether or not, the academic penalty, I think, is really a discussion with you and the chair, associate dean, whatever resources looking at the policy. But I think you'd have a leg to stand on to report that and say, I noticed, the same process that Paul outlined of, I noticed that you had signed in, you weren't in the class, tell me about this. And then if they say, yeah, I did that, you would say that actually is you're not allowed to do that. So this is
I
something.
mean, I do threaten. I've never reported, but I do threaten.
You know, that I think that's your discretion as the instructor about how you handle it. Certainly if you had repeated violations, but the fact that you're framing it that way, and Paula and other associate deans, I don't know if how you've seen that applied, but it is sort of there as a way of talking with students and dealing with it.
I think
Falsification of academic records is basically what it turns into.
yeah,
Sure. Rebecca, how big are your classes typically?
Well, so for the intro class, between 50 and 90,
Okay.
right? 88-ish, call it.
Right.
I think it's a good opportunity for a conversation with the student. And, when it's a situation where you're not awarding specific credit for attendance, I think in my mind, that's harder to generate an academic penalty for. But to have the conversation with the student that, look, if this continues, I'm going to write you up because I think that this is wrong. I think that the rules allow me to say that this is wrong. And if you're not going to attend, just don't attend, and take your medicine. Basically, don't try to fake it. And I long ago had conversations with colleagues about attendance in large classes, and oh well, you've got to do this and you've got to do that, you got to make them show up. And my takeaway was always, I want them to want to show up. I don't want to make them feel that if they don't show up, it's a penalty situation. I want them to want to be there.
No, I don't want to
So-
penalize people for not showing up either.
So-
So this is copacetic with everything I was already thinking and doing. Two quick things for you. The most egregious case I had was in a class during the pandemic, and that student failed the class for the natural consequences of not coming and everything. And then she came and she took the class in a different semester, and she called it her semester of redemption. And she was awesome. And it was fantastic. Right. And so I feel like things are still welcoming and good. And honestly, whenever I've had to address this with a student, there has been a real acknowledgement that, yes, that's wrong. Yes, that's lying. Yeah. There's only been really sort of shame and embarrassment, and not any pushback about anything else. And this semester, last thing, I have started randomly giving extra credit to people who come to class on certain days. So instead of penalizing, which I have funny feelings about, but instead of penalizing people who don't come, I just reward the ones that do on those certain rough days. And
Rebecca, you
Timing
just
is
mentioned,
important, yeah.
Rebecca, you just said out loud something that I had actually typed in my own notes here. Is attendance a factor of hidden bonus points? Yeah, this semester with people in and out all the time for COVID and other things, even though attendance was on my syllabus is counting. I think it was pretty obvious that I couldn't count it. But I do have to say there were a few people who were there through thick and thin every single day, and maybe or maybe not, they got a little nudge. Yeah.
yeah, but you want to be transparent about it, right?
Yep.
And make sure it's out there for everybody to know about. And I hate doing it on days when there's games and I know the athletes aren't there, right? So I never did it, we're not trying to unintentionally penalize people for their extracurricular activities. So, but thank you all.
So what else do people have?
Hey, everyone, this is Steve Smith. I just had a question. If a violation results
We lost Steve.
can everybody hear me now?
Yep.
If a violation results in a failing grade, is the student allowed to repeat the course to remove that failing grade?
They are, as long as it's not an XE, Steve, they'll be able to repeat the course just as any other failed.
Okay,
So
Thanks.
it's- Yep.
I also have a question connected to a unusual case, or maybe I shouldn't talk about it. Okay, let me ask it this way. If a student ends up with a C- as a result of a violation, they cannot repeat it. Can they take it at another school so that they can erase the C-? Or is that C- on their transcript forever? So this
Yeah,
would be related to students who are like us very strong students and they want an A and they're getting a B and they don't want an A. So, right.
They're, Magdalena, they're stuck with the C-, although we do allow students to repeat C- in certain situations, but it will never count toward GPA or toward credit.
Mhm.
So there are some, for instance, some nursing programs that require you to have a minimum of a B- or something like that in certain classes like organic chemistry. And
Mhm.
we've had situations where a student gets a C in organic chemistry and they need to get into this program or they want to get into this program, and we'll allow them to repeat the course so that they can get that grade. It will be on the transcript, but it won't have any impact on credits or on GPA.
And the thing, maybe Paul and the other folks can correct me, but what I learned through Ramin was that once you have an Oswego grade, I believe an outside grade doesn't trump the Oswego grade.
Yeah.
So C- wise, that is obviously if you have a D, that is something different. But I think once you've, but I've actually had a student go repeat something and fail it. Actually, they had passed it somewhere else and they failed it at Oswego. So the Oswego grade trumped because they didn't see that they had gotten credit for it, so it was a mistake.
Yeah.
And that has happened. So that was my understanding through Ramin, that the Oswego grade trumps.
Yep.
So this is only tangentially related, but the Student Experiences Project has a nice little best practices, very short review for syllabi, and part of that includes what kind of language, what kind of additional supportive language you can put in along the lines of what Paul was talking about. You know, definitely don't be dishonest. However, there's all this language about how you can how you believe that they can be successful and that there are tools in place. So I'll put that link in the chat if you want to look at it.
Thanks, Kristen. That's good. I mean, it's something that we want everyone to be upfront with students about, and it doesn't help you to gloss over it. It doesn't help anything to give lip service. So, you know, I think that there are a number of faculty who have the mindset of this is an upper level course. You should have learned how to do this, whether it's how to cite properly, how to do research, how to do whatever. You should have learned that already. I'm not teaching you that. And frequently students haven't learned how to properly cite things or whatever else, or maybe they were in a class that they were able to get through plagiarizing, but the instructor just turned a blind eye to it. So how do you help that student by continuing to kick that can down the road? Anything else? We've still got 6 minutes. Another in-person person.
I'm a librarian with Penfield, and I am about to actually overhaul our citation guides. And I was wondering if anyone here had any recommendations for me on how to improve student engagement and use of them, or things that you'd like to see in a citation guide that you think would be most helpful for your students.
I'll just note, I tend to, I'll just confess, I'll start with the confession, is that I tend to bring students to the OWL in Purdue. And so typically there's a guide, but I usually have a sample paper. You know, Purdue has these sample papers. Economics doesn't have a standard style, so I let students choose MLA or APA or Chicago if something's really, really wrong with them. But you know, they're free to choose that. But so I'm not responsible for any PTSD that results from the Chicago manual style. But APA, or you know, but anyway, I give them the top 3, and they can see sample papers, and I give him, there are Word templates and Google Doc templates out there, you know, that they can also use, or plugins that you can load in. So we go through all of those kind of resources. So those are the kind of things I find helpful. I really discourage kind of easy bib and some things like that, because they basically leave a ton of stuff blank, and then students think it's correct and it's not, right? Because they're not doing the legwork. So any kind of cautionary note about some of the automatic citation generators can be missing a lot of information. And just because you automatically generate a citation doesn't make it correct. That would be important.
It's helpful, thank you. And I also refer people to OWL, won't lie.
Oh, the OWL is great. The Duke University writing program is also really fantastic and has excellent resources. I'd really encourage you to, as you overhaul those materials, consider giving plenty of space over to discussing, I guess briefly, but the why and the logic behind citing things. I find that students get very hung up on, do I have the right style? Do I have the right this? Do I have the right that? And honestly, in my intro course, we have exercises where I just send them to Zotero, and we populate a Zotero database, and we tell them, like, just don't worry about the style. The machines will do it for you. What you need to worry about and understand is why we cite, when we cite, who are you citing for, why, right? And they think it's just to get out of trouble and because their teacher said so. And the logic behind, right? You want to demonstrate engagement. You get to explain what work you've done and have it reflected in your own work. You get to say, listen, I don't have time to talk about that here, but if you're really interested, go like that, right? There's all this utility behind citing and strategically and responsibly doing it that they also need to know about. And once you explain all of that to them, I find them much more interested and motivated to be thinking about when and how they do it, as opposed to just the mechanics of, you know, where does the date go? Where does the author's name go?
And I've been thinking about citation as an equity issue too, like not erasing voices and things like that. So that's great.
In my discipline, we use whole names, and that started as a gesture to make sure that women's voices were not being, right. Not that you can tell gender all the time by names, and gender is changing now too, but yeah, there's lots of ways to be doing lots of good politics and equity in our citations too.
Rebecca, I like your comment about them understanding why and how it's more than just protecting themselves, but I'm still at the level of having them protect themselves. So I tell my physics majors, if you weren't born knowing it, cite it or quote it. It may be a paragraph with 15 citations, almost one on every sentence, if you're really collating a lot of different resources and trying to put your own thoughts together. But awkward and ugly is better than plagiarizing. So I again, don't worry about the style, just get it covered to start with. But I like your idea of really taking that step into how professionals use the citations as well.
Yeah. And my librarian friend, I have some slides if you want them. I'm happy to share.
Yes.
Chris Munger, did you have a point?
You know, I just love the idea of like the companion to catching and penalty really is prevention and teaching. And, you know, the discussions about why, one of my fears is that, you know, students may get too scared to include information because they're not sure how to cite it. Like they can back away from, you know, really trying to bring voices or, you know, documents or other things that are hard to cite where they'd have to look them up. So that's why, you know, combining this with, you know, drafts where people are trying, once they get the spirit of, you know, Rebecca, like what you were saying, why you're doing it and embracing that spirit, even if it's not in the perfect form, that ends up being a teachable moment. So, I mean, I do worry that there could be sort of a narrowing of what people will draw upon if all they're thinking about is the penalty and not the knowledge.
And the engagement, right? Citations demonstrate your engagement in the work you've done. I try to play it up a little like that. It doesn't get the whole job done. There's a lot to it, of course, as you all know, but right? Like it's a reflection of your work and you're rewarding yourself and others when you say what you've done and read and seen.
Kristen, MLA's latest update, they tried to expand what they tried to be less strict so that you can adapt citations more, so that you can capture those things where there's not necessarily an established form where it's not traditionally been included in that conversation.
So one thing, Nicole, that you're going to have to be aware of is that there are lots of instructors who will schedule their day in Penfield. They will have their students meet with the librarian, and that will be their washing of hands for anything related to plagiarism. So it will not be an ongoing conversation. It'll be I've checked the box. I've sent the students off to Penfield to do their anti-plagiarism routine, and I'm in the clear. So unfortunately, that places a larger burden on our librarians to be super and to get students to do things that is probably asking too much of you. But just so you're aware, that is something that happens.
Thank you. That's why part of why I'm here asking all these questions now, so that I can get the feedback here.
Anything else? Well, thank you everyone for showing up. And I hope that you have a great plagiarism-free summer.